everyone.
You don't say any word in Swedish?
I don't remember.
Oh, you don't remember any word? She's learning Swedish and she cannot say anything.
I stopped study.
Okay.
I think I remember. Hey, Juan Modu.
Okay. The Swedish Vikings were not like any other Vikings. Here's why. By their Ancient Witness YouTube channel.
Oh.
Look, I'm going to be straight with you about something that's been bugging me for years. Every time someone brings up Vikings, they picture the same thing. Bearded warriors with axes, raiding monasteries, drinking from horns. But here's what nobody tells you. The Swedish Vikings were playing an entirely different game than their
Really?
Scandinavian brothers. While Norwegian Vikings were discovering Iceland and Greenland, pushing into the frozen Atlantic, and while Danish Vikings were conquering England and building empires, the Swedish Vikings, they were halfway to Baghdad. They were founding what would become Russia. They were serving as the personal bodyguards of Byzantine emperors. And here's the kicker, the name Russia itself probably comes from the Swedish Vikings. One of the world's largest countries is literally named after these guys.
Really?
By the end of this video, you're going to understand why the Swedish Vikings were different from their Norwegian and Danish brothers.
Let's be.
How they were the most commercially sophisticated, the most politically complex, and arguably the most influential Vikings in shaping the medieval world. Now, before we dive in, we need to establish the baseline. Yes, Swedish Vikings shared some things with their Norwegian and Danish cousins. They all spoke Old Norse, worshipped the same gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, and built longships. They had the same three-tier social structure, with jarls at the top, carls in the middle, and thralls at the bottom.
Oh. Speaking of Old Norse, I reacted to Ermeneling in Old Norse the other day, and people from Iceland told me that they could understand.
Really?
Yeah, Old Norse is similar to Icelandic these days, apparently.
But the Swedish Vikings took this common foundation in a radically different direction. And it all started with one simple fact. Geography is destiny. While Norway had mountains and fjords that forced people west across the Atlantic, and Denmark sat at the gateway to Europe with rich farmland, Sweden had something else entirely, access to the east. The Baltic Sea and the river systems of Eastern Europe became Swedish highways. The Dvina, the Dnieper, the Volga, these massive rivers could take you all the way to Constantinople, to the Black Sea, to the Caspian Sea. And the Swedes realized something that changed everything. There was more money in trade than in raiding.
In the east, they became known as the Rus, or the Varangians. That
Rus?
name Rus, which probably comes from the Finnish word for Swede,
Russian. Russia. Rus.
Rutsi, that's where we get Russia. The Swedish Vikings didn't just visit Eastern Europe. They founded the cities, established the ruling dynasties, and literally gave the region its name. Around 862 AD, according to the Russian Primary Chronicle,
Wow.
Slavic tribe
Why nobody talk about that? When we think about Vikings in like TV show and movie, we always think about like the one that pillaged, the one from Denmark, right? Or Norway. I've never seen a documentary or a TV show about Sweden that went to Russia.
Well,
You've
I
seen
think
it?
you know why.
Why?
Maybe they don't want the history to be like that.
Actually, that's pretty smart. I agree with you.
were fighting among themselves so viciously that they invited a Swedish chieftain named Rurik and his brothers to come rule them. Swedish Vikings became the ruling class in what
Sneezing? Sorry, our dogs is having a big dream.
would
One
become
of our dogs.
Kievan Rus, establishing a dynasty that governed these lands for centuries. But here's what's fascinating. Within a generation or two, they'd assimilated. They adopted Slavic language and customs. They intermarried with local populations. This wasn't conquest in the Danish sense, where you impose your culture by force. This was integration. The Swedes understood that to succeed in the East, you had to become part of the East.
Now, let's talk money, because this is where Swedish Vikings really distinguished themselves. Archaeologists found tens of thousands of Arab silver coins, dirhams from Islamic caliphates, in Swedish hoards, far more than they found in Norway or Denmark combined. Swedish Vikings were trading furs, amber, slaves, honey and iron all the way to Baghdad and beyond. They'd travel down the Volga River, navigate hostile territories and arrive at markets where Islamic merchants would pay premium prices for northern goods. And some went even further. They made it to Constantinople, the richest city in Christendom, and became the Varangian Guard, the elite bodyguard unit for Byzantine emperors. Byzantine emperors trusted these warriors more than their own subjects because the Varangians had no political ambitions in court. They just wanted...
Well, I know another reason why they don't talk about them, because they went east. Norwegian and Denmark, they were piling in Western Europe, like in that area of the world. What is east? Everything that is really east, we don't learn that in school. Everything that is east, we don't learn that in school. So when you talk about Constantinople and everything, which mic is the best? This one or this one for me? So yeah, they went east, and I guess that's not something that you learn in school because it's extend even more far than Europe. So that's why you don't hear about it. I had never heard of this story, that Russia come from the Swedish Viking, the name Russia. And think about what Gustav Vasa did also. When we reacted to Gustav Vasa, his life, it was the same principle, trying to be more like ally with people instead of like imposing your will on them if you have no choice. But I'm comparing with Gustav Vasa, where the goal is to create a structure, a societal structure that worked for the most people. They were basically doing capitalism back then.
Yeah.
In a way, they were already trying to build a society
wanted
in a
gold,
certain way.
and they earned it by being the most feared warriors in the empire, wielding massive two-handed axes.
But back home in Sweden, the political
This is when I
situation
touched
was
this.
completely different from Denmark or Norway, and this is crucial to understanding Swedish Viking culture. Sweden, as a unified kingdom, didn't really exist during most of the Viking Age. You had the sphere in the north, around Uppsala, and the Gotar in the south. Real power wasn't held by kings. It was held by aristocratic magnates, wealthy noble families who controlled land and trade. In Denmark, the king could command massive public works projects. In Norway, power
I was gonna make a stupid joke, but it's true. They had their own Israel at the time.
Oh.
was hyperlocal and violent. But in Sweden, the king couldn't do much without the approval of the powerful aristocracy. There are accounts of Swedish nobles overruling their king on major decisions, particularly about religion. The Swedish aristocracy was more like a merchant oligarchy than a warrior nobility. Their wealth came primarily from controlling trade routes and commercial networks, not from raiding or conquest.
And you can see this aristocratic power in the archaeological record. Sweden has over 3,000 Viking Age runestones. Denmark has about 250. Norway,
Wow.
around 50. Why such a massive difference? Because Swedish noble families needed to proclaim their status and assert their claims to land and power. These runestones were advertisements. This land belongs to our family. Our ancestors are important. We have wealth and legitimacy. The inscriptions tell incredible stories. He died in the east with Ingvar's army. He traveled to Greece. These weren't boasts about raids, these were records of commercial expeditions, of men who travelled enormous distances for trade and mercenary service. The Gotlandic picture stones are even more spectacular. The most famous is the Chang.
I know it's AI, but are these all stone that you have?
Yeah, right now.
I know that some in Uppsala, I saw a video and they have some of the stone. I think for all the kings, it's like it make a square shape. There's like 4 of them, something, on some kind of little hill. I don't know.
Vide stone, which shows a warrior on an 8-legged horse, probably Odin on Sleipnir, being greeted by a Valkyrie. Below that, a ship full of warriors. It's a complete visual representation of Viking afterlife belief. Die bravely, sail to Valhalla, feast with the gods forever.
Now, let's talk about religion, because this is where Swedish Vikings get really interesting. While Denmark and Norway converted to Christianity, Sweden held on to paganism longer and more fiercely than anyone else in Scandinavia. The temple at Uppsala was the major pagan sanctuary of the Norse world. It was the center of Swedish religious, political, and legal power. Adam of Bremen described Uppsala as having a golden temple with 3 god statues, Thor in the center, flanked by Odin and Freya. Every 9 years, according to Adam, all of Sweden gathered for a festival where 9 males of every living creature, including humans, were sacrificed and hung from trees. Now, Adam was a Christian writing after the fact, trying to make paganism look barbaric,
Sacrifice
but
humans.
archaeology backs up some claims. Animal bones and human remains have been found at Uppsala. Uppsala was more than just a religious site. It was where the thing of all Swedes met, where laws were made, disputes were settled, trade happened, and religion was practiced, all controlled by the pagan aristocracy. This made Swedish paganism deeply political.
So when Christianity spread through Scandinavia, Sweden resisted harder and longer than anyone else. Denmark converted around 965. Norway was forcibly converted by 1030. But Sweden held out until well into the 12th century.
Yeah.
The first Christian Swedish king, Olaf Skullkonung, was baptized
Olaf?
around the year 1000. But huge portions of the country stayed pagan. The pagan aristocracy used traditional religion as a power base to fight against royal centralization. Christianity meant centralized royal authority and divine right to rule.
Unpopular opinion, I think paganism is better.
Yeah?
Because you can see nature. You can see nature like rain, you can see thunderstorm. This you can see with your eyes. God, you cannot see.
God, you cannot see.
You can see the devastation of Mother Nature. You can see that. Like that's what they believe in, right? In the pagan world, that nature and the gods are the one like making the thunderstorm and everything like this.
Oh, yeah, that really, really good. Really
At least
real.
it's something that you can see, right? Like, I don't know how to explain it.
Paganism
It's like
meant distributed power
the logic
among the nobles.
make a lot of sense.
This created
in a way.
actual civil wars. In the 1080s, pagan nobles temporarily overthrew Christian king Inge and installed Blot Svein, literally sacrifice Svein, specifically to restore the Uppsala sacrifices. Inge eventually won and supposedly burned down the temple around 1087, but pagan practices continued in remote areas for generations. Swedish Vikings in the 10th and 11th centuries were far more likely to still be practicing pagans than their Danish or Norwegian contemporaries. When Danish traders were getting baptized to do business in Christian towns, Swedish warriors were still sacrificing to Thor at Uppsala. Now let's compare Swedish warfare to Norwegian and Danish approaches, because the differences are stark. Norwegian warfare was personal and decentralized. A recent study found that 37% of Norwegian Viking Age skeletons show lethal trauma. More than 1 in 3 died violently, mostly in feuds. Over 3,000 Viking-age swords have been found in Norwegian graves. Your sword was part of your identity. Danish warfare was organized and strategic. Large armies, coordinated campaigns, fortified bases. But Danish graves contain almost no weapons, only a few dozen swords, because weapons belonged to the state. Only 6% of Danish skeletons show lethal trauma, almost all from state executions. Swedish warfare was commercial. Swedes fought when necessary, but they fought for profit. They didn't conquer kingdoms, they joined armies as mercenaries or became military elites in foreign states.
Maybe it's not talked about a lot because people don't consider them Viking. Because when people think of Viking, they think that you go to war, right? And you conquer. But they were more doing trades. Other part of the world were also doing this. But them, they were like Vikings doing this, which is not something that seems intuitive, but
The Varangian Guard is the perfect example. Swedish warriors getting
Varangian?
rich serving the Byzantine emperor, then returning home to raise runestones, proclaiming their wealth and travels.
Swedish burial practices reflect this pragmatic mindset. While Norwegians did elaborate ship burials to demonstrate power, and Danes moved toward Christian burial early, Swedes did a mix. The grave goods in Swedish burials often include Eastern artifacts, silks from Byzantium, Arab coins, Slavic jewelry, proof of the deceased's travels and commercial success. Then, instead of burying all that wealth, Swedish families invested in rune stones that would proclaim success for centuries. So here's what defined the Swedish Viking: pragmatism, commercial ambition, aristocratic independence, and political sophistication. Norwegians were warriors and explorers, driven by land hunger and personal honor. They discovered new worlds, but remained politically fragmented. Danes were conquerors and state builders, organized under powerful kings. They conquered kingdoms and integrated into European power structures. Swedes were traders and founders, building commercial empires through networks rather than conquest.
so like Denmark were strong and powerful, Sweden were smart, and Norway were like rebellious brother, like mad at their neighbor for like existing. The Norwegian make them look so bad in this
They
video.
founded cities from Staraya Ladoga to Kiev. They served as elite mercenaries from Baghdad to Byzantium.
Yeah.
They established the ruling dynasties of medieval Russia, and they maintained a powerful aristocracy that kept their kings in check for centuries.
The Swedish Vikings gave the medieval world something unique. They created trade networks that connected East and West. They left the most complete documentary record through thousands of runestones. They preserved pagan traditions longest. And they founded Russia, literally gave it its name and its first ruling dynasties. But here's what makes the Swedish story compelling. They did all this not through force, but through integration and adaptation. They became Rus by marrying Slavic nobility. They succeeded in Constantinople by serving loyally. They dominated Baltic trade through relationships, not violence. This was a different kind of Viking success story. Not the romantic tale of Norwegian explorers or the dramatic saga of Danish kings, but something arguably more sophisticated. The story of merchants and mercenaries who
Bro, this is proof that IQ doesn't mean much. Would you see someone these days say, oh yeah, we're going to go somewhere and we're going to integrate like this? These days you just conquer like the Danish are doing. What Denmark were doing back then, it's what the world is doing right now when they want to go somewhere.
No, that what China is doing still. Going for trade.
China?
Oh?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. The only country who's doing what Sweden used to do is China these days.
Yeah.
The West is doing what Denmark is doing. was doing historically, and China is doing what Sweden is trying to do.
How many Chinese in Canada?
A lot. It doesn't mean that it's not sneaky and there's not like a financial motive, but China is the other Swedish Viking of the time right now, to be honest.
Built a transcontinental commercial empire.
I wish that Europe would trade
You
more
can
with
still
China
see the
because this is
Swedish
the future.
Viking legacy today. Russian cities like Novgorod and Kiev were Swedish foundations. The Rurikid dynasty that ruled Russia for centuries descended from Swedish Vikings. Swedish political culture, that balance between strong institutions and powerful elites, that preference for consensus, traces directly back to the Viking Age balance between weak kings and strong aristocrats.
So the next time someone talks about the Vikings, like they're one unified group, you'll know better. The Swedish Vikings looked east, while their brothers looked west and south. They traded while others raided. They founded cities while others conquered kingdoms. They integrated while others imposed. And they preserved the old ways longest, while slowly, pragmatically adapting to the new. The Swedish Vikings were a distinct civilization with their own values, strategies, and incredible legacy. A legacy that stretches from the rune stones of Uppsala to the founding of Russia, from the Varangian Guard.
Despite that, in 2026, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are all doing pretty well.
Yes.
Despite having completely different Viking. At one point, they were fighting each other a lot, right? Sweden and Denmark. And at one point, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all understood the same thing about the power of not fighting each other anymore. They have not been at war for a long time, like 500 years, I think, the last war between them. So
To the silver hordes that testified to commercial ambition on a scale Europe hadn't seen since Rome. These were merchants, mercenaries, founders and traders who built an empire not of territory but of networks. And in many ways, their approach was the most modern, the most sustainable, and the most influential of all the Viking peoples. The Viking Age wasn't one story. It was three parallels the world.
yeah, and to be honest, it's even 2026. I think it's one of Sweden's greatest strengths. They are not initially remaining neutral, but they don't try to. They are not too greedy.
And also they open for like immigrant.
Yeah, but right now there's far right movement in Europe because
of
Trump is so
course.
popular, and Trump is very popular with Europeans. A lot of Europeans love American politics. I don't know which way Europe is heading. I hope that you guys will wake up in time
do
before it's
what?
too late. Because in Europe, they have a lot of centrist government, right? They are not left-wing, they're not right-wing, they are centrist, right? Then they make decisions and people are mad that too many immigrants come and they blame the left. They blame far-left people for the immigrant, but far-left people are not in power. So they should blame the government. The government are centrist. They are not leftists. So leftists are never been in power anywhere in the world almost. We should start blaming the right people. Just my 2 cents. Anyway, thank you guys for the amazing suggestion. If there's more, let us know in the comment below. Yes.